Hollowed out by decades of underinvestment, Britain's armed forces are barely fit for purpose and would struggle, some say, to field a warfighting division. This is World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and joining me today is former Armed Forces Minister James Heappey. James, thank you for joining me. You've described Britain's armed forces as hollowed out. Could we fight a war tonight?
Yeah, well, of course we could, because we'd have to. And, the sort of what we have remains a number of incredibly capable brigades. Our lead armoured brigade, 16 Air Assault, 3 Commando Brigade, the lead light mech brigade are all very good capabilities. So yes, of course we could put a division into it. And it's worth reminding people, because people often forget this, that the last time that a UK division was in the field, so the beginning of the Second Iraq War, 2003, that was not a sort of squared off armoured division of 4 armoured brigades. It was 1 armoured division and 16 air assault. So it was, so it was already at that point a blend of armoured and light. So yes, a division can go to war. Now, if I may, though, I want to pick up on the hollowing out point, because I think that it is language that I use often and necessarily, but I don't think it reflects a conscious decision to hollow out. It just reflects the journey the British Armed Forces have been on operationally. I served in an army that was fixed by Iraq and Afghanistan. And on all 3 of my deployments, 1 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, I deployed as part of a brigade of about 8,500, 9,000 people. Now that's, and that was massively disproportionately in favour of combat troops, so battle groups on the front line. The number of logisticians and engineers that should support, in a normal war, that should support that number of troops, nowhere near the ratio, far fewer. Why? Because KBR were doing the logistics, they were doing the catering, the engineering was all fixed site. So what...
Those are KBR civilian contractors.
So civilian contractors. So what the army was allowed to do in the kind of defence reviews between, say, kind of 2005 or sort of between 2005 and 2015 is we were allowed to cut a whole load of the enablers, but keeping a whole load of the fighting echelon stuff. Some of that was to do with the politics of cap badges, but actually it was to do with just the design of the force that was required by Task Force Helmand or the Basra Brigade.
James, let me tell you though, General Sir Richard Shirreff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, the most senior British post within the fighting arm of NATO, has said that we cannot field a division. He said a division 20 to 25,000 men. And in fact, he said recently that he thought we would struggle even to field a fully equipped brigade. We also know that the head of the American Army, Chief of Staff General Randy George, has warned explicitly in a talk which he delivered to the head of the British Army, said, if you come to war, make sure you've got everything you need for the fight, because we won't be able to provide it for you. And subsequent to that, we've reported in The Sun that the British Army's budget has actually been cut, despite the promises of this sort of 75 billion extra for defence. The British Army is facing a real terms cut this year and next. What's going on?
But all of those things can be true, right? So why the army has changed shape in the way that it has, why it hasn't got the logisticians, the engineers, the signallers, the enablers that make it a fully fleshed out as opposed to hollowed out force, is because of the journey that the army went on operationally over the period sort of 2005 to 2015. Richard Shirreff is entirely correct in that because the army hasn't been focused on divisional level armoured manoeuvre for 25, 30 years, it simply couldn't, I think, get out of the door and operate as a division. But you asked me, could we get a division in the field? And just like on Telic 1, the original invasion of Iraq, of course we could, just wouldn't be the first armoured division that Richard Shirreff would remember from the British Army of the Rhine in the sort of late 90s.
Let me ask the question differently. Could we field a division which could match a Russian armoured division? I mean, that ultimately is one of the roles.
Right now, comfortably.
We could.
I mean, look, Russia has lost 1,500 armoured vehicles, hundreds of thousands, its entire first echelon army destroyed. So could the best that the British Army could get out of the gate tonight beat the best that the Russians could put into the field after 2 years of their extraordinary folly in Ukraine? Yes, of course, we could.
And how long?
But that spares people's blushes, because Russia will rebuild. And therefore, whilst I don't want people to be alarmist and get silly headlines that say that the British Army couldn't be, of course, the British Army within NATO could absolutely defeat what remains of the Russian army, because Putin has spent everything on Ukraine. But Russia will rebuild. Therefore, the UK and NATO more generally must rebuild its proper war-fighting capability. That means the ammunition in our stockpiles, that means the enablers, the logisticians, the signallers, the engineers, the kind of boring bits of defence, but fundamentally they're the bits that keep the fighting echelon rolling forward.
So we could put a division in the field tonight in some shape or form. But how long could it last? Without those things that you've just mentioned, the bullets, the logistics, the stockpiles, how long would it last?
Well, I think Putin should know that it can last for long enough to beat whatever he can generate.
Was it a concern for you that when you were in office, that the longevity, the sustainability?
I'm on the record. I mean, in fact, the thing that I think some of our political opponents find most hard to understand is that when Ben Wallace, the former UK Defence Secretary, and I were talking about the hollowing out of the force, we were doing so because we were being brutally honest, both publicly and internally within the department, about the fact that the answer to just, can we have another 100 tanks? Can we have another 5 destroyers? Can we have another 20 combat aircraft? Is no, until you've got the ammunition, the spares, the engineers, the infrastructure for servicing those aircraft, ships and armoured vehicles. You know, once you've rebuilt all of that, once you've got the force that we've got at the moment working properly, credible, exactly as the American general said, ready to turn up into the fight with everything that it needs, then after that, we can start having the conversation about growing the force. But just constantly trying to buy shiny new things for the front line without investing in the boring bits will mean that we don't regain that armoured, high-intensity war-fighting capability that we had during the Cold War, withered during the Iraq and Afghanistan years, and that we must now urgently regrow.
And let me ask you about shiny new capabilities. Those cuts to the Army's budgets, my understanding that when you were in office, when Ben was in office, both former Army officers yourselves, there was an understanding or perhaps a direction that the Army's budget should not be plundered.
That's true.
To pay for the Royal Air Force and to pay for the Navy. And yet it seems that since you've left, that is exactly what is happening. The Army losing money to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds to pay for new RAF jets and Royal Navy warships.
So difficult for me to comment on decisions that I think have been taken since I left office or I was not privy to whilst I was in office, if they were taken before that. It's definitely the case that Ben gave very clear direction that the Army's budget must be protected. That's not because he was a former Scots Guardsman and I was a former rifleman and we were looking after our own. That was just a simple reflection of two things. Firstly, that the Navy and the Air Force had largely recapitalised. If you look at sort of Typhoon, F-35, A400M, Voyager, Protector is coming. Those are fantastic, current state-of-the-art aviation capabilities. The Navy with Type 26, Type 31, Type 45 destroyers, the Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carrier, Astute-class submarines, Dreadnought nuclear submarines in build. They've got a pipeline of some of the world's best maritime platforms coming through. The Army was still going to war with stuff that was manufactured in 1970.
And that's going to last even longer now that their budget's been cut.
So that's why the Army's budget was protected, because the recapitalisation of the Army was so urgent. Also, you have to protect the Army's budget because the Army's budget, because their platforms are the cheapest, they are the easiest to salami slice away. If you take away an entire warship, yes, you save £1 billion, but you've just written off a quarter of the programme. If you take away 5 F-35, yes, it's £500 million, but you've just taken away an entire squadron. Whereas you can slice away bits of the Army without anybody really noticing, which we wanted to protect.
What would you say to the current defence chiefs, both the former colleague Grant Shapps and indeed the uniformed chiefs who appear to have made this decision?
That the UK is a proud maritime power. Our history revolves around, or the most celebrated parts of history revolve around a global naval dominance. And I absolutely understand that there are some big strategic programs, particularly in the Navy, like, for example, SSN-AUKUS and the replacement of our nuclear deterrent, that cost a huge amount of money. But the role of the British Army within NATO is also hugely important. We are regarded as being one of the very best, if not the best, army pound for pound in NATO because of our training and the way that our soldiers do their business. And I think that if we find ourselves in a position where we are overtly making a trade against land power in favour of air and sea power, that would be a great shame. I think our geography is undeniable. We're an island nation. We're one of the gateposts to the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. Of course, our role within NATO, as it was throughout the Cold War, is very heavily focused on the North Atlantic and keeping those sea lines of communication with America open. Of course, that's really important. Of course, the strategic nuclear deterrent is fundamental. But there reaches a point, as Ben and I did, when you just have to turn around and say the army risks going below critical mass and therefore it needs to be protected, irrespective of the importance of other programmes.
James, thank you very much for joining me on World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below and we will endeavour to answer some of them next week.